Okay. Finance is much bigger in Edexcel it's much bigger in AQA than it is in Edexcel, and it's bigger in Edexcel A than it is Edexcel B. I don't really know how it fits into OCR. I also keep meaning to look at OCR and IDCAS, but anyway. The thing with finance that I'm finding is that it's not a discrete topic. So I used to think it was just this add-on that they added in the 2015 specs, but it's really not, because you've got kind of the functions of money, which you could put into a bit on specialization, and indeed that's what they do in Edexcel. You've got the links to monetary policy and how much do you bring in and when. You've got the kind of foreign exchange, and then you've got which you could bring in the whole when you're doing trade, or even in your ADAS analysis. You've got the kind of regulation, you've got the links to the financial crisis. So it's a very broad topic. So my first question is, do you teach it as a chunk of all, a chunk of financial economics, or do you separate it, or do you kind of have little bits elsewhere and then a bit of a chunk? There we go. That was my financial economic dance for you there. I think I would be tempted to split it up. I'm teaching AQA next year, and I actually think that some of it would be better to move into different parts, but it's really difficult. I wonder whether them having some of that knowledge earlier on might help with their reading and things like that, and to understand what's going on in the news. Any thoughts on when you introduce the various bits of financial economics?
I couldn't find my hand up button. I have tried to bring it in as we go, but I don't know whether that is a sort of function of the kind of class that I have in my year 12 class. They're very interested in financial markets. They all really want to go into finance and that sort of thing. So I'm trying to get them to sort of have an understanding as we go through of what these terms mean, when they're talking about it, how it fits into sort of economic theory as well. So I've tried to bring it in as we go, but I don't know. I'm a new economics teacher, so I don't know whether that's the best way to do it, or whether there's better ways to do it.
So what have you brought in kind of earlier on in the course that's perhaps like?
We've just looked at the financial crisis a bit, again, trying to encourage them to do a bit of outside reading, trying to, look at what has happened in the last, when I did economics A-level, this was a different time. We've had two massive financial situations happen. So I'm trying to get them to be able to sort of have a big picture of what's happened in the last 20 years. So in order to encourage their reading, trying to sort of give them a little bit of a background as to what life has thrown in the last 20 years. But at the same time, I'm sort of not going into the specifics of it, because again, I don't feel like they've got the foundations to really understand it all.
That's interesting. Guy says tries to drip feed articles and tutor you through optional reading on Google Classroom first, just to kind of like build it up, I'm guessing, in the background. I mean, it's very easy to think that financial economics, like I used to think that financial economics was all about the kind of stock markets or whatever, and I can kind of put it to one side, it's this add-on. And it's really not, in that, and it does have some real fundamental impacts on the economy. So for example, the functions of money. I really like, there's a YouTube series, I think it's something history, advanced history, extra history, I think it's called, and it's a 6-part series on the history of money, and it is absolutely fascinating. It's all like a cartoon, and it is quite easy to watch, but there are 6 episodes. I think they're only like 10 minutes long, but I'd really, really recommend that. What do you think about introducing the functions of money perhaps in year 13 versus introducing it in year 12? Do you introduce it alongside specialization, or would you leave all of that to later? And how do people introduce the kind of functions and roles of money? So Manisha saying you start in the summer and then come back to it.
Yeah, I didn't know if Andrew was going to say something then.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. So we do functions of money specialization. At the end of year 12 in the summer, we then start looking at the financial crisis, and we kind of start then doing a bit of synoptic stuff with it as well. And it links to the paper. We do a whole paper 3-day, like a whole synoptic off timetable day at the end of year 12. And then we come back to it properly at the end of year 13.
And so, I mean, this is one of the things about the Edexcel course. I really like teaching the financial crisis, but it's frustrating because the spec, you're designed to teach the responses to the financial crisis. But if you tell a 16, 17-year-old that we're going to do the responses to this big recession, they're going to want to know what caused it in the first place. And that's really, really difficult to unpick in the kind of 20 minutes before you watch The Big Short. So it's how you can do that. But it is a really nice topic because it does bring in basically everything I've learned about kind of Keynesian classical demand side responses and all of that. How much do you go into that? How much do you go into the kind of into, I don't know, like shorting and whatever, when you do the financial crisis in year 12?
We don't, but we find the ones that want to will go into it. So we get them to also in micro lessons at the end of year 12 to pick an industry and do an industry case study. So ones that are really interested, I'll then say to them at that point, why don't you do the financial market? And that's then their point to then go ahead and have a look themselves. Because there'll be some that are just completely lost and it just doesn't seem... Yeah, also probably me, because not a macro teacher. So I think that kind of gets around it. So if they want to then do it and look at it in more detail, then we have a lot that do that. And especially the ones that take history or politics, they also know a lot more and want to know a lot more about it.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrew.
No, well, I'm not sure I've got anything particular to say really. I do like Gavin do and Manish do. Yeah, I mean, in specialisation, I'd have done a little bit of like, and of course you need like a form of exchange to do this, don't you? And I'm not sure you need a huge amount more than that at that stage. And then, about now, well, a few weeks after Easter, I'll do some financial market stuff. But that, of course, is in the context of having done quite a lot of, market failure things. And that leads to an interesting sort of, feels to me like a sort of summer discussion of, to what extent is this market failure, and what do we even think about information and blah blah. So it comes at quite a sophisticated point, I think. The financial crisis and some of those aspects. How much they really need to know about central bank operations and things like that, I'm never entirely sure really, because that's extremely complicated once you start scratching beyond the surface. And
it is, and the Powell and Powell textbook is so bad on this chapter. I'm really sorry, Mr. Powell and Mr. Powell are here, but it is impossible to understand. It's really quite condescending as well. But it's because it's convoluted, isn't it? A lot of the work, the terminology is convoluted in central bank operations.
Yeah, I will be doing it in a few weeks' time about, I'll do that stuff you said about the functions of money in a bit more formal way. We'll do some stuff about the reasons and functions of various financial markets, and think about it in a market failure sort of point of view, and that will sort of be it really. And it's sort of enough. We did the basic sort of stuff about bonds and things, but the questions you tend to get don't tend to require actually a huge amount. So you might get a quite tricky multiple choice, possibly, that really requires a little bit of detailed information about about sort of reserves and something. But then where they've used them so far in the bigger questions and the essays and stuff tends to be a little bit either that market failure, market structure sort of side of things. You might go, banks, they're a bit concentrated, aren't they? And you do that in year 13 anyway. And or you get a little bit of you can drop in some QE type things if you want to use that in an answer to a wider macro question. Very rarely do they say, did QE work then? Which, proper economists don't have a defined answer to either. So I'm not entirely sure how much, even though it's on the spec, how much you really, really need to know or understand how avoidable it is, possibly, certainly in AQA, at least for the options.
And what's stranger is that AQA has a much bigger content, but I found it tested on Edexcel quite a few times, and there was even in, I want to say 2018, a really cheeky 15-mark question on the role of finance in developing countries, which, considering they don't do much on finance, and then they're kind of discussing the role of finance in developing countries was quite a tricky one. On the specialisation aspect, part of me thought, oh, you know, could we leave specialisation until year 13 when you come to look at kind of marginals, you know, have a look at production costs and revenues and things like that. But the thing is, it's so fundamental, and actually this is kind of the functions of money bit as well, that it is so fundamental to why economics is just this awesome science. Because I really like the iPencil poem article, whatever it is, but it's just, so iPencil, it basically just goes like, it's the story of a pencil and the fact that it's all like different people having to do different, you know, different bits, and it's amazing that this comes together somehow, and I think the specialization leads really nicely into that. And so as much as I kind of think sometimes it's a bit of like a random bump in the narrative, it kind of doesn't always fit into what I want to do, but I think it's important to get that down there early on to say, look, actually this is how weird and complex and amazing our economic systems are, because somehow all of this happens, and that's just to create a pencil. Like, think about the crazy stuff that goes on. Just lots gone on in the chat here that I'm just going to try and catch up with.
There's a nice guy who made a toaster as well. Have you seen that one?
Oh, no.
Similar thing. He tries to make a toaster, and it cost him well over £1,000 to make a £5 plastic toaster, and it's not even any good when he's on that.
Oh, okay, that's pretty cool. I sometimes use the you know, a cup of coffee. If you have a cup of coffee, how much has had to go into that, and thinking about, well, you've got to make machine server. That might be at the start. That might be at the start of one of the books.
Do that for. Oh, sorry.
It might be the brief introduction to economics. I don't know. Manisha, go on.
I do that for specialization, like breaking down all the components, even then, like when breaking down everything that kind of goes into it. So yeah, I pretty much do the same thing, but I didn't know there's a video, which I will now need to find.
There's also a nice illustration of iPencil. There's a video to go with that as well. It's quite sweet. So Yusuf's put a document in about misconceptions, and so Gavin's saying you do it in the summer. Discussions related to the financial crisis, and then have a big discussion. And when it comes to bonds, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but it's the only method that I found that works, is that I don't even want to say it. Yes, I do. Is that I do tend to do a little bit of role play. And I don't mean like everyone has to make a script, but I do mean I'll get 3 people up and say, right, I want a loan. So you're going to have a portion of my debt. And then you then sell that on. So what actually interest rate are you getting? And I find actually, mainly because it's the only way that I can get my head around it, is to kind of think of different people. But, you know, people passing around these pieces of paper that say, you know, gilt or bond or whatever on it, sometimes is helpful. I don't know if people can manage to do that without the role play. I'd be really interested to know those strategies, because it is pretty cringy. Don't see AS, but do it but teach as if we do. So the monetary policy of AS means they have the basics, and then you come back to it, and that's quite common in the AQA type specs as well, that you look at it in the basics in the first year and then you come back to it in the second year. What do students find most difficult when it comes to financial economics? For me, it's the language, but the kind of terms, they're just a bit convoluted. Any thoughts there?
Well, can I try and answer with another question? I wonder how much people really do money creation at all, and how, you know, effing weird that is. And you know, here's these banks just making up money out of nothing, and how students get their head around that, really. I suppose I
find that really, really difficult. And then because you're basically saying, hey, the circular flow is not really right. So I don't know what the answer to that is. Any ideas? Any other thoughts on money creation? They do need to know it in AQA, don't they? They don't need to know it in Edexcel. They don't need to have some idea. I think when I've tutored at AQA, I've only gone as far as assets and liabilities, and that they make both, therefore they're making both, and that kind of going through that aspect. But it's one of those things that if you think about for too long, it kind of makes my head hurt. So I don't know. Galaxy, I'm glad you're saying that you're doing role play as well. That makes me feel better. I mean, we're not like doing interpretive dance or anything. We're not going crazy, but it's literally just like giving someone a piece of paper, and this is how much you're going to get in a couple of years' time. Anything else on that? Any tips you give to a teacher teaching it for the first time? Any tips? Any resources? Any strategies? Anything left on that before we start to discuss the teacher assessed grades. Someone's saying good MR University on specialisation. I love a bit of MR University. I mean, he does have a really boring voice, but God, he explains things really well. One of the Edexcel suggested questions on their help sheet related to behavioural economics was to get students to research how financial crisis was caused by irrational behaviour. Yes, and actually, they also say on the Edexcel spec that it's to know the external to know market failures caused by in the financial markets, and that's quite a nice one, because there is basically every form of market failure in that market. So it's quite a nice one to summarize financial markets at the end. Summarize market failure, because it kind of has a bit of everything in it. That's pretty useful. Gavin's advice is give it to the other teacher if possible. The thing is, in my head, financial economics is really boring, but it's not, because so much of it is so fundamental. But it's just getting to that really exciting spark that this is how our economy works, is just really, really difficult, because you have to wade through all this language and whatever before you get there. And also, it doesn't help that because if they're looking up information, the American vocabulary is different to the British vocabulary, so often they find it very difficult to check themselves and reference. It doesn't help that the Edexcel textbook's really, the Anderton textbook is very, very clear, actually, I find, but the Powell is really quite difficult to read. So there's lots of things compounding here that make a big difference, but students do enjoy it. Gavin, I'm not going to click that link, because I'm just because I've learned enough not to click links. But if you could just give a shout as to what that link is. Oh, is that the MR University one? Yeah. Okay.